Hey there everyone, it's Joe. Welcome back to my channel. Now, a question I often get asked by anyone who follows my channel that's a Final Fantasy TCG fan often asks me about certain cards they find problematic or decks that they're finding hard to beat and how they can beat them. So I'm sitting there thinking, what kind of video can I make to cater to players that are asking these questions? And I figured out that I think that having some anti-meta picks would be a really good video to make, because I think there's a lot of people out there that sit there and get upset about the fact that they can't beat, say, Mono Ice, which is a very popular deck in the Opus VI format, but don't really know how to get around it. So here today for the video we're going to be going through a few picks for anti-meta picks that you can make in your deck to cater to particular matchups that you're really struggling with that maybe you may not have thought about until now. Now, before we can identify how to go about beating a particular meta, it's important to identify what the meta is. Now, for those of you who don't know, a meta, or a metagame, is descriptive of a general play environment, and it can be a local metagame, so for example, your store, the decks that you expect to come up against when you're playing there, and it extends beyond card gaming within video games like fighting games. Street Fighter, for example, if Ryu is particularly popular in a particular area, then he could be considered the meta game for that area, and therefore players going into it will need to figure out how they beat Ryu in order to progress, and the same applies here. So for the moment, certainly within sort of the spring Opus V meta, which we do still seem to be going into quite heavily for the next while, regionals etc. are coming up, there are a few different decks that are very popular. Mono Ice is evidently very popular by way of things like Orphan, and it's got a lot of sort of control aspects and discard that make it very popular. Mono Earth is really good for just getting really big guys and very consistent plays by way of things like Miner, Star Sybil, and it has access to the ever popular Shantoto. And then you also have Mono Water, which comes in a variety of different ways, whether it be monsters or knights beatdown. There's lots of different ways that water can work. And then as I said, with monsters, you have different variants of that, where, Mono Water Monsters is very popular, Wind Water Monsters is very popular, Wind Water Earth Monsters is pretty popular. There's lots of different variants of that. These are all different things that you should be bearing in mind when you go into a tournament environment, so that you can figure out what you expect to come up against and can your current deck beat it. And if it can't, then you might need to rethink some of the things that you might be playing. So the first card I'm going to talk about is actually quite an obvious pick when it comes to certain metas. So if you feel that your meta is full of mono-coloured decks, then Camlanaut from Opus VI can do absolute wonders for you. Camlanaut is good in any deck, and one of the key things with a lot of anti-meta picks is that they kind of need to be at least somewhat relevant in your deck regardless of whether you see them or not, because there's no sideboard in Final Fantasy TCG, so they have to bear that in mind. But with Camlanaut, he's just a solid forward anyway. He is a 5-drop 9k, however, he searches for something when he comes in, so you could treat him as a 3-drop 9k, particularly if it's Chaos that you use search for. He can search for any dark card, so he's fairly future-proof as well, so with future releases of any dark card, it's always worth keeping this guy in mind. However, against a mono-coloured deck, particularly Ice, which is mostly, targets your opponents forwards by dulling them or freezing them, Lightning also applies here because it applies a lot of removal. If you manage to get Camlanaut's Survive return, he can change his element to any element he wants, and that element can't target him. So this is less relevant against like Earth and things like that, because they can power their guys up and they can use Shantoto, which doesn't target and things like that. However, it's a very strong card anyway, so it's a great card if you think that your meta is full of ice or lightning or even water, because it cancels out things like Tonberries, which are very potent. Then maybe Camlanaut is worth looking into. Now, the next cards I'm going to talk about are the reason that Mono Earth does quite so well against Mono Ice. And then there's a variety of ways and ratios you can play these cards, and that's Guy from Opus 1, Yang from Opus 5, and Black Mage from Opus 4. Now, these do things in different ways, but all of them kind of amount to the same thing. They stop your guys from being dulled. Guy and Yang do it self-sufficiently. They themselves can't be dulled, and therefore they, don't take up any additional costs or anything like that, unlike Black Mage. But one of the important things to note with Black Mage is that neither Ice nor Lightning, which is another colour that's very prone to dulling cards by way of things like Ammon or Lightning, there's lots of different ways that it does that. Black Mage can't be targeted very easily by can't be targeted almost at all by a Mono Ice or Mono Lightning deck. They have to have backup destruction, which is not common for those decks. You'd have to be going Ice Earth or Lightning Wind or something like that in order to deal with Black Mage. So they're then having to counterplay you because you're then counterplaying them. Yes, you do have to pay additional costs into it, but I quite like running at least 1 or 2 of the forwards, whether it be Guy or Yang, depending on the curve of your deck, and then 1 or 2 Black Mage as well. If you think that Mono Ice or Lightning are going to be very, very popular in your meta, then these cards are definitely worth looking into. In a similar vein to Guy, Yang and Black Mage, there are a few other cards that you can use to counter Mono Ice, which are very, very popular. The Water has access to Astrologian and Ash, Ash being a very, very powerful forward in her own right, and Astrologian allowing you to push further with your game and then overextend a little bit if you've got the resources to pay for it, so they're not bad even if you're not using them to counter ice. And you also have Cleide. If you're running a particular night build, then she does wonders against ice for you, because again, ice has no backup destruction naturally, it has to delve into either wind or earth. And then Wind also has access to Oracle and Barrelite, which also serve a similar function. However, they have the problem that they have to break themselves in order to get their effects off. Although it does, again, allow you to overextend beyond your means if you're willing to pay the cost to pay for these guys. And against Ice, they do very, very well. Now the next card I want to talk about is Aerith. Now Aerith was pretty popular in Opus 3, and she was, a different version of Aerith was very popular back in the Opus 1 and 2 days, but now she's fallen off the radar a little bit. It might be worth looking at her again now that if you think that Fire or Lightning are very, very popular in your meta. Fire decks tend to run a lot of Red Mage and or Ninja, which are both cards that prevent your forwards from blocking. So if you can make it so that your guys can't be targeted by your opponent's backups effects, then it makes it a lot harder for Fire to push its damage through. Similarly, Lightning uses things like Black Mage and, well, Black Mage to drop your power or destroy a damaged guy. Though this isn't just a limited use for Aerith, there are a ton of cards that she sort of cancels out. A good number of cards that she can cancel out include Teller, Black Waltz 2, Irvin, Alphinaud, Black Mage, as previously stated, Seymour, Masked Woman, Ralban, Yuna, then the list goes on and on and on. There's a lot of different backups that do target your guys. You don't really want to run more than 1 or even 2 of Aerith, because there are a lot of matchups, particularly Ice, where they don't really target your forwards very often with backups, so it might be a bit of a wasted slot. But again, it's important to note that there is no sideboard in Final Fantasy TCG, so you kind of have to bear every matchup in mind, at least somewhat, when you're building your deck. The next cards I want to talk about are Hecatoncheir and Archer, which are both Opus 1 cards that used to see a ton of play, but over the course of the game's history have fallen down in popularity. However, I think that these 2 cards are still extremely potent, and they should be at least factored into when it comes to building any Earth or Wind deck, and that's because backups can win games. You'd be surprised how often setting your opponent back off backup, you'll get that sentence out, can really stunt their growth. And not only that, it all depends on the timing in which you use it. Archer has a little bit of a disadvantage here because your opponent can see it on the board before it goes off. However, Archer can target certain things that Hecatoncheir can't, and vice versa. My favourite use of these cards, however, though, is to use Hecatoncheir as a summon, obviously, during combat to take out a power boosting backup, because with monocoloured decks being as popular as they are, they're all going to be running power boosters in some degree. If they're running Wind, then they're going to be running Maria almost certainly. So if you think that your opponent's guys are going to be very, very strong, then Hecatoncheir can help you a lot. A play that I really enjoy doing is attacking with something, and then mid-combat using a Hecatoncheir on their power booster to drop their guy's power down, and that stunt and that swing in momentum can cost your opponent the game entirely. So it's definitely worth bearing this kind of thing in mind. And with Archer and Hecatoncheir, if your opponent has a slow start, which does happen in these games, you can make it even slower. Like if they're having to discard 2 to play a 3 CP backup that doesn't search, or 4 CP or something like that, and you just return fire with a Hecatoncheir or Archer, your opponent's going to struggle to pick back up from that while you're still building all your backups up. It's really, really powerful, and I think it's a very, very big shame for these cards to be forgotten. Now the next card I want to talk about is a card that was once horrendously popular to the point where people wanted it to be banned, but it's just fallen off the radar over the course of time, and that's Minwoo. Now Minwoo was once in every single water deck. People splashed water just to play Minwoo. It was amazing, everyone had to have it, and the card is still very, very good. However, it seems to have fallen off in a lot of water decks purely because it's 3 CP and it doesn't give you any kind of advantage. It doesn't plus, it doesn't search, it doesn't do anything like that. It just has a passive effect. So why is Minwoo still good? And that's because Mono Lightning is still really, really good. Al Cid is still in a very, very large number of decks. It's still very, very meta. It's been carrying Lightning since Opus 2, and if you think that Lightning is a problem in your meta, then start running Minwoo, because if you get it down early enough, then it's really difficult for Lightning or Lightning Wind or Lightning Fire variants to really push forward on their game plan, because a lot of Lightning relies on chip damage. It means that they have to start dropping power in order to deal enough damage for Minwoo to not really matter, by way of things like Black Mage. You know, there's a lot of other ways that they can get around it, but using Minwoo means that they're that much slower off the bat. The decks shouldn't really be relying on chip damage anyway. They should have other countermeasures to the decks that you might be playing. That being said, Minwoo can still help you in combat as well, in combination with some of the other things I've stated, like Hecatonkai or a power booster. You'd be surprised how often Minwoo can still come into play. If you don't like the fact that there's 3 CP in its cost, then you could always opt for Flintlock instead, which is a 2 CP version that does a very, very similar thing, though it does cost the fact that it has to dull itself in order to get its effect off. Forward Shantoto is another card that, in combination with Dudaluma, which is another card that does chip damage, the list goes on. There's so many cards that Minwoo can counter effectively, it would be a real shame for the card to just see no play at all. And the last card I want to talk about is Poram. Now, Poram was always kind of a black sheep within Opus 2. However, with the dawn of Opus 5 Poram, this card's actually really, really good, and it can really slow your opponent down or make it so that their aggro tactics are that much slower, and you can use Poram as a method of getting out Opus 5 for Porams, like preferably on block or after your opponent activates an effect that would get her away, which is very, very difficult to do, by the way, because whenever she's targeted she can just bounce back to your hand. She only costs 1 CP. You can apply pressure with her very, very early, and you can then use her for draw power later, so the consistency of your deck can go up with Poram as it is. Poram isn't necessarily an anti-meta pick for a specific colour, and she is getting more popular over the course of time. I think people are starting to notice that this Poram is actually very, very good. You just have that 1 CP pressure play, which forces, if you have a forward out and your opponent doesn't, you're forcing them to play a forward, otherwise they're going to start taking damage from this tiny little thing that could cost them the game, so they have to then answer your answer. And then if they go aggro on you, you can just leave Poram up, and so that you're not taking damage, and you can use Poram's effect to then switch her for the other one and start drawing cards. And then the other Poram is very, very sort of controlling in and of herself, because she has an ability that cancels action abilities, and she just works in perfect tandem with a water control deck. So playing Poram, if you're worried that your opponent is playing too fast for you and you can't keep up, Poram can help slow them down. And the last thing I actually want to talk about before ending this video is actually nothing to do with the cards themselves at all. But with a particular meta, you have to kind of do a bit of research into how other people are playing. And you have to figure out what it is that they're doing that perhaps you aren't, or one isn't. For example, in the finals for the Spring Cup, the first play of the game was a lock, turn 1. Which is crazy, right? That's mad. That's not an anti-meta thing. That's like one of the biggest meta cards in the game. However, it was the way in which the lock was played, having known that he was playing against a monster deck, and that because he's 7,000 power, and most monsters are weaker than that, except for Green Dragon, which he'd then have to like play it, then pay for it, and his opponent then has to get a Green Dragon down very, very quickly. Otherwise, that lock is going to start pushing your opponent to the point where they can't keep up with you. And you can still build up by that. Yeah, you lose a bit of advantage at the beginning of the game because you're paying 2 cards for a 3 CP guy, but just having that card there can really goad your opponent to doing something they're not necessarily willing to do. So it's not all about which cards you're playing, it's also about the way in which you're playing them. So, like I said, do a bit of research. The example hopefully I'll be able to speak to you guys sooner rather than later. So thanks again, and I'll see you soon. Bye.